Economic Impact and Global Repercussions,
Okay.
published March 11th, 2025.
Fresh off the presses.
Very fresh. So
Insisting.
what's interesting here is that Dr. Adam, an associate writer for the Journal of Islamic Psychology and Philosophy,
Okay.
he comes out strong,
Really?
saying that Trump's tariffs backfired due to a lack of economic understanding.
A lack of economic understanding. So he's saying they were ineffective.
Well, he brings up the American soybean industry as a prime example.
Okay.
China, a huge buyer of U.S. soybeans,
Right.
hit back with their own tariffs, and as a result, American soybean exports plummeted,
Makes sense.
and that really hurt American farmers.
Yeah, of course.
And it had this ripple effect through the whole agricultural sector.
So instead of protecting domestic industries, the tariffs actually ended up hurting them.
That seems to be the case.
Huh. And it also just highlights how interconnected the global economy is.
Right.
One country's actions can have these unintended consequences that just reverberate across borders.
Yeah, Dr. Adam also points to Professor Xingjin Wei,
Okay.
who argues that Trump's tariffs did exactly what many people feared.
What's that?
They raised costs for consumers,
Right.
hurt businesses here at home,
Of course.
and disrupted global trade.
So a lose-lose situation.
Yeah, it seems that way. It certainly wasn't the simple win that some might have envisioned.
Yeah. But then the question becomes, how did other countries respond?
Exactly.
Were retaliatory tariffs the answer?
Well, Dr. Adams seems to think that they weren't particularly effective.
Why not?
What's his reasoning there?
Well, he argues that many countries rely on a trade surplus with the U.S.,
Okay.
so they sell us more than they buy from us.
Right.
So their options for imposing tariffs on U.S. goods are limited. Plus, those retaliatory tariffs would end up hurting their own citizens and businesses, too.
Right.
So it's a dilemma.
It is a dilemma. So if tit-for-tat tariffs weren't the answer, what other options did these countries have? How could they push back without directly mirroring the tariffs?
Well, that's where non-tariff responses come in.
Non-tariff responses. Okay.
Yeah, these are ways to exert pressure without directly mirroring the tariffs.
Can you give us an example?
Absolutely. Consider China.
Okay.
They have a near monopoly on rare earth minerals.
Right.
These are essential for high-tech industries.
Yeah.
By restricting exports of these resources, they could really squeeze U.S. firms
Okay.
while benefiting their own companies.
So instead of a direct tariff battle, they're using their control over a key resource to exert leverage.
Exactly.
That's a clever tactic.
Very clever.
What about the EU?
The EU.
Did they have any unique plays?
They came up with the anti-coercion clause.
Anti-coercion. Interesting.
Yeah.
What is that?
Essentially, it allows them to temporarily suspend intellectual property rights payments to U.S. companies
Okay.
or restrict market access for U.S. financial institutions.
So they could basically stop paying royalties to companies like Netflix and Microsoft.
Potentially, yes.
That's bold.
It is.
Or they could limit the reach of U.S. banks and financial firms.
Right.
It seems like President Trump might have overestimated U.S. leverage in these trade negotiations.
Yeah, that's what Dr. Adam argues.
He does, but what's the real cost of miscalculating that leverage?
Well, for starters, U.S. exporting firms could see their profits dwindle.
Right.
And here at home, we'd all feel the pinch as the cost of living goes up.
Yeah, makes sense.
But perhaps the most significant consequence is the potential damage to the global trading system, the very system that's designed to benefit all participants.
Right.
When one player starts throwing their weight around, it can undermine the whole structure.
And that brings us to Dr. Adams' point about the potential domino effect on interest rates.
Interest rates, okay.
This is where things get a bit complex.
All right, I'm ready.
But I'm ready to dive in.
Let's do it.
Okay, so essentially, higher tariffs lead to higher prices for goods.
Right.
Now, to combat that inflation, the Federal Reserve might raise interest rates.
Okay, I see where this is going.
And that can trigger a global chain reaction.
How would that play out?
Well, think about it. Higher interest rates in the U.S. can lead to a global retrenchment of liquidities.
Okay.
This could lead to a wave of bankruptcies for firms and governments with high dollar-denominated debt.
Right.
And as other central banks around the world follow the Fed's lead,
Yeah.
we could see interest rates climb globally, hurting households and businesses everywhere.
So the ripple effect of these tariffs could be felt far beyond just the prices of goods.
Exactly.
Right.
It could impact global financial markets, businesses, and individuals around the world.
Yeah, and that's what makes understanding the complexities of these economic decisions so crucial.
Right.
We need to be aware of the potential unintended consequences before we start setting off these kinds of chain reactions.
This has been quite a deep dive so far.
It has.
And we've only just begun to scratch the surface.
Yeah, just the tip of the iceberg.
But we're going to pause here
Okay.
and pick up the conversation in just a moment.
Sounds good.
So we were just talking about how those tariffs could set off this global interest rate domino effect.
Yeah, it's kind of crazy how one policy decision can have these huge consequences.
Yeah, impacting businesses and individuals all over the globe.
It really does highlight how interconnected everything is.
It does. But let's shift gears a little bit
Okay.
and look at the big picture.
The big picture, right?
What does all this tell us about protectionist policies like tariffs?
The million-dollar question, right?
Right. Was this like a short-term gain for long-term pain?
Well, Dr. Adams' analysis definitely seems to suggest that in this case, the tariffs didn't really achieve their intended goals. Instead of like boosting American industries,
Right.
they seem to trigger all these unintended consequences.
Yeah.
Hurting American businesses and consumers.
So instead of bolstering domestic industries,
Yeah.
it seems like they might have actually thrown a wrench into the gears of the global trading system.
Yeah, that's the danger with protectionist policies.
Yeah.
They often seem appealing on the surface,
Right.
like protecting domestic industries, creating jobs.
Yeah.
But the reality is way more complex.
Right.
There's always a risk of retaliation, unintended consequences,
Right.
ultimately more harm than good.
So if tariffs aren't the answer, then what are the alternatives?
Hmm.
How can countries navigate global trade in a way that's beneficial and fair for everyone involved?
Oh man, that's the question economists and policymakers have been grappling with forever.
I bet.
There's no easy answer, no one-size-fits-all approach.
Right.
But Dr. Adams' analysis of the Trump tariffs, it does offer some really valuable insights.
Okay. I'm all ears. What are some key takeaways?
Well, firstly, we need to recognize the interconnectedness of the global economy. Decisions made in one country, they inevitably impact others.
Makes sense.
Any effective trade policy's got to consider those broader ramifications.
So it's not just about focusing on what's best for us right now. It's about understanding the global implications of our actions.
Exactly. And secondly, we got to be wary of those unintended consequences.
Right.
As we've seen with these tariffs.
Yeah.
Even well-intentioned policies can have these unforeseen and often negative ripple effects.
Right.
Careful analysis and consideration of potential downsides are just crucial.
Like a game of chess, you can't just focus on your next move. You have to anticipate your opponent's responses and think several steps ahead.
For sure.
But is there any way to actually mitigate those unintended consequences?
Yeah.
Or are they just an unavoidable part of the global trade game?
It's impossible to predict every outcome, obviously.
Right.
But promoting dialogue and cooperation on the global stage can definitely help mitigate negative consequences.
Okay.
Trade wars and protectionist policies, they tend to be these zero-sum games where one country wins at the expense of another.
Right.
But global trade has the potential to be a win-win if all parties approach it with a spirit of collaboration and fairness.
So instead of building walls,
Yeah.
we should be building bridges through open communication, transparency,
Right.
a willingness to compromise.
Exactly.
But before we move on, I have to ask about Dr. Adams' point about interest rates.
Okay, interest rates.
How did that domino effect that he predicted actually play out?
That's where things take an interesting turn.
Okay.
Remember how Dr. Adams suggested that the Federal Reserve might raise interest rates
Uh-huh.
to combat that tariff-induced inflation?
Yeah, and that could potentially trigger a global chain reaction,
Right.
leading to higher interest rates worldwide.
Uh-huh.
What happened? Did his prediction come true?
Well, the reality is always more nuanced than any single prediction.
Okay.
In this case, other factors came into play.
Like-
As the global economy started to slow down,
Yeah.
concerns about a potential recession, they grew.
Right.
So the Fed, prioritizing economic stimulation over inflation control,
Yeah.
they actually lowered interest rates.
Wow, so they chose to address the more immediate threat of a recession over the longer-term risk of inflation.
Exactly.
It's